Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Welcome back to Writer's Digest Presents. In February of 2021, WD managing editor Moriah Richard began a Flash Fiction February challenge on the WD website. The challenge is back for a second year this year, so we're dedicating this episode of the podcast to Flash Fiction. You will hear interviews with Rand Walker about Flash Fiction and with Gina Bareka on Flash Nonfiction. And as a bonus, you'll hear the second half of Moriah and Michael's MFA conversation from episode 1. But first, we'd like to chat a little bit about writing short stories and flash fiction. So, hello, everyone. Glad to see you all again.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
So, I want to start off by talking about the February writing challenge. And I was here when we started it. It's only a year old. But for the life of me, I can't remember how it came about. Can anyone remember?
I can start us off on this. Moriah and I would often meet like weekly to talk about stuff we were going to do online. And we would talk about, just the content that we're going to put on there, the articles, blog posts, all that type of stuff. But we also would usually just kind of brainstorm at times, like just talk about, things we care about in writing or things we'd like to see. And I know talking to Moriah, she had this great interest in flash fiction. I just started thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool to do like a daily flash fiction challenge? Because we actually do that in April and November for poetry, where we do like a prompt a day, a poem a day, and like I would write a example poem to whatever the prompt is for poetry. And I thought this might be fun for flash fiction, but I didn't want to like force it on Moriah, but like Moriah like heard the idea and was like, yeah, let's go do it. So Moriah, like, I'll let you like kind of take the baton from there, because that's kind of what you did. You like just took that idea and like ran with it.
Yeah, it was one of those things where since graduating from my MFA program in 2017, I'd kind of had like a very long writing dry streak. So I like half wrote 2 different novels, and I'd kind of let writing flash fiction go to the wayside, which was unfortunate because that's really the only things that I've gotten published before are my flash pieces. So it felt like a sign from the writing gods that like, hey, not only are you going to encourage people to participate in this kind of writing, which you really enjoy, but it'll kind of force you to have a deadline and to write these pieces with everyone. So that's really like what inspired me to really dive into the project. And the biggest thing from last year's challenge that I just did not expect was the joy of sharing what in my program we called our shitty first drafts, which it was kind of like a no-no, right? Like when you come to workshop, you don't want to have a first draft. You want to kind of have some polish to it. So I was very weird and insecure. And Robert will tell you, I would be like, I can't believe that I'm going to be posting these first drafts. I'm kind of nervous about what people are going to think. And Robert was really kind. And ultimately he said, this is to show everyone else that it's okay to not have a perfect piece to share. It's just about sharing the joy of writing. And that really happened on the comments of those posts. Everybody was replying to each other, saying, the things that they liked best about the pieces, and really just celebrating this month of getting together and writing together. It was really awesome.
It sounds like it. So there were how many participants generally or approximately were there last year?
Oh, I'm not sure, Moriah. Was it like, it had to be over like 100 something.
Yeah, from the top of my head, I think that the most posts on one day's prompt was somewhere around like 130 stories were shared.
Wow.
And then on like our lowest day, I think we had something like 72.
Yeah,
So,
and those are the ones where people are actually posting. Because I know
Right.
from the Poetry Challenge that there is a lot of writers who will write poems and then let me know. Like, I remember last year being contacted by someone who'd been writing the Poetry Challenges for like over a decade and said that she finally had the bravery to like share poems this past year.
Wow.
On there, but that she had been writing along at home, but not posting it to the site, which is like another fun part of the challenge. Like, I think it's fun to be able to share with people and get that feedback, but it's also like, if you want to do it privately at home, I'm an introvert, so like I totally get that. It can often seem like at times like that I'm not, if you read stuff I post on the site all the time, can make it seem like I'm a lot more talkative than I am, but I'm just as scared as anyone else to share stuff. So like I totally get that, but yeah, like I think for the comments, like, you know, it's probably like about 100 like or so that were commenting, and then who knows how many writing silently along at home.
Wow.
And it's like so much.
Yeah, that's
like
incredible.
I don't know for you, Mariah, like that's like kind of one of the really uplifting parts of the challenge is just the whole community aspect of it.
Yeah, it definitely is. And, you know, even one kind word can give you a boost you didn't know you needed. And I know for me personally, I have taken some of the pieces that I wrote for last year's challenge and polished them up a little bit and have performed them at open mics. And I'm actually going to be doing a live critique through a writing group locally in a couple of days, which is like another form of terror. Basically, I'll be reading the flash piece live. No one will have read it beforehand, and then immediately after, they will critique the piece. So it was really just that I thought, you know, if all of these people are looking at my shitty first drafts, then, and they're giving me nothing but kindness, you know, it's not going to hurt me if I do this live critique.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see the way that community can really boost you, not just your writing, of course, but just you personally and the way that you view your own work.
So true. I'm sort of in awe of both you and Robert for being able to post your poems and your short stories on the website for everyone to read.
Amy, maybe by this time you
not...
and I will have done one.
I can probably commit to one.
Me too.
We'll try and make that happen, Michael.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, so I want to talk a little bit about. I interviewed Rand Walker for this episode of the podcast, and we got to talking about our experiences with reading flash fiction, which for me, I was telling him my experience reading short stories is very, very different than when I read longer book-length works. So with books, it's sort of like an addiction. I can't not be reading a book. So after I finish one, I don't sit and think about the book that I just read or internalize it or have feelings about it to a point where I can't pick up the next book. I have to pick up the next book almost immediately, which is not great sometimes because then, you know, I lose the thing that I just read. Or sometimes I will end up conflating two books that I've just read. But with short fiction, with short stories, I feel like it's a much different experience. After I finish one, there's that moment that really hits you. I feel like short stories end on a bang almost. And I have to sit there and think about and process what I just read because it feels like so much has happened in such a short space, in so few words, and I find that incredible. I wonder what your experience is like with reading short fiction or short works.
I totally agree with you, Amy. And I think there's something about short stories and flash fiction where it's this weird experience of less is really more. And short fiction just has the opportunity to be really experimental and unique, and it follows its own rules a lot of the times, in my opinion. And when I'm feeling as a writer particularly stuck or uninspired, I will probably pick up a short story collection or read a short story before I'd start reading a novel, because though I read novels sort of in the same way that you do, just sort of compulsively, short fiction just does something to my brain that like immediately makes me want to be more creative. And I think it's just because there are less rules around it, because you have less time in short fiction, so you get to do kind of whatever you want.
I think I'm kind of the opposite, where I will read something, and if it hits me in a certain way, I become obsessed. So the outlet for that, especially if like it's just a one-off book or like the end of a series, is fan fiction.
Yeah.
And fan fiction, like when we talk about drabbles, those are stories that are just like 50 to 100 words a lot of times. And it's really fascinating to see the way that people interpret different characters, but also like what Michael was just saying, how they explore different mediums. So one of my favorite flash pieces ever is a fan fiction that is based on a Reddit thread. So you're literally reading a story and it's just a Reddit thread with these characters. And it was so strange and fascinating that that's where one of the prompts from last year's Flash Fiction Challenge came from. I asked people to write somebody's Tinder bio, and that was the story. So I think that there's something about short fiction that drives you outside your comfort zone and outside the box, and it really makes you look at things from a different perspective.
Yeah, and I'm maybe a little bit closer to Moriah in how I read stories, whether they're long or short, is like, you know, well, and maybe I'm totally different, because like you'll move on to the fan fiction, but like I read something and I'm not usually ready to like jump into the next thing. I'm usually like, all right, I've got this big world in my head. Now what do I do with this world? And how do I process this? And where do I go with it? Do I write something? Do I read something? Where like a lot of times, like I'm not even sure. And I like to kind of sit with it, even if it's for like the night or whatever. So sometimes, like when I read a short story collection, like I'll think, okay, this short story collection's like 250 pages long. It's got like 12 stories in it. This novel's like 500 pages long. I can knock out that 500-page novel in about the same time that I can knock out about 3 stories from the short story collection, because it's like I have to like kind of sit and process each story as I go through them. So even though they're shorter, I've got this, like it's almost like I give the same amount of emotional weight to each of them, even though one's much longer and probably like more involved with all the characters and the plot and everything. It's like that short story is also like its own little world anyways. So it's kind of, it's interesting, and it's something I really didn't think about till you asked the question. It's like, oh yeah, like it is a little bit, it's a little bit different. Like in some ways it's kind of the same how I read them, but it's also a little bit different, because you would think that the word count would be similar, and that doesn't really matter. It's like the world itself that's similar for me. So
Yeah, I think the word count is part of what interests me about that, and I think why I do pause, like take a pause after the short stories, whereas I don't with the novel, because with the novel, I've had 70,000 words, and I'm sort of, occasionally I will feel sad about leaving that world and be ready to move on, or want to stay in there, as opposed to moving on.
Yeah.
But with the short fiction, because it's so few words, I'm so, it's like I'm impressed by the novelists who can write that many words about a story and make it coherent and hold their and my attention for that amount of time. But I have another kind of respect for the short story writers who can do so much, or the equivalent of a novel in such a short amount of space. Yeah. That deliberateness with the words that they use, I think, is really impressive. So are there any short stories or works of flash fiction or nonfiction that will always live in your head, that you will never be able to forget?
I can start off. I started thinking about the concept of flash fiction, and this isn't the greatest example of flash fiction, but I always think this is like one of the most brilliant, funny, like shortest and longest story ever written. It's by John Barth from his Lost in the Funhouse story collection. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but he has this story that just I'll put it in front of the screen for people who are just listening. Basically, on one side of the page, it has this "Once Upon a Time" there, and it's got this dotted line where you're supposed to cut that strip out of the book, and the other side of that strip says "Was a story that began." And what you do after you cut that strip out is that you tape the two sides together, so it kind of makes like an eternity symbol where it just says, "Once upon a time there was a story that began, once upon a time there was a story that began," and so on and so forth. And it's not deep, but I just think it's so funny.
Yeah.
and it's it's as short as 10 words long, and as long as infinity.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's so cool. I hadn't heard of that.
Yeah. It's the book is called Lost in the Funhouse, and it's a great collection of short fictions. It's a little bit older, but definitely worth a read. And beyond that, like any short fiction by Laurie Moore, Andrea Barrett, like I love their short fiction. Speaking of like short stories that feel like incredible, well-formed worlds, Andrea, like Laurie Moore, like can make me laugh with like, I'll just be reading so concerned about whatever's going on, and then she'll hit me with like a one-liner that makes me laugh out loud, and I'm like, how did that just happen? And then Andrea Barrett, I'll read hers, and it might be like a 30-page story, but I feel like I've just gone through like the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy because it's so dense and wonderful. So
I think mine is probably pretty standard. It's generally attributed to Hemingway, although there's like no proof, but it's just "For sale, baby shoes never worn." And the thing that I think is so incredibly powerful about that one sentence story is that it is packed with emotion, but it doesn't have any visual element to it. And as a writer, I very much conflate emotion to setting, right? So like description and like even characters describing how they're feeling is often how I can slip myself into that story and feel those feelings. But in that one sentence story, it doesn't need that. It just serves up that emotion to you right there, totally honest, and I love that.
Yeah, I always love that that example, and it always feels kind of like a haiku in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I love Lauren Groff's short writing. I think she is just such a beautiful writer. But when I think of short stories, and this might be because of the experience I had with the author, I think of Ben Laurie a lot, and he writes really, I think this is a good word, weird fiction. And he writes like, I would say like adult fairy tales. Like he takes concepts of how we used to write stories and then just makes them really unusual and really short. And he has this collection called Stories for Nighttime and Some for the Day. And there's a story in it called The Shadow. And it's literally like 2 sentences. And it's just, once there was a man who was afraid of his shadow. Then he met it. Now he glows in the dark. And it's just like that over and over again. Like the collection is just a little bit folklore-y, a little bit fantastical, but really emotional too. There's just something really sweet about his writing. And when he came to the university I went to and did a reading, and I was really nervous to meet him, and we got our book signed, and when it was my turn, he asked me what my name was. And I am also an introvert and like don't know how to, especially post-COVID, like have no idea how to interact with people. And I just handed him my copy and I was like, oh, my name's Michael, spelled the normal way. And so he signed it to Michael, spelled the normal way. And I was like, oh, you're really funny and sweet.
That's perfect.
But also I just want to throw out Lydia Davis is some of the best flash fiction I've ever read. She wrote a story about finding her dog's hair around her house after it passed, and it's like I think a paragraph long, and it's just so emotional and beautiful.
I don't think I would be able to read that story.
Yeah, it was a bad idea. Like I shouldn't have done it, but I'm glad I did it.
Yeah. I think so. For me, some of the stories that live, the short stories that live like rent free in my head, are the typical ones that you read for the first time in high school, like The Lottery or Hills, like White Elephants or Four White Elephants or whatever the Hemingway story one was. But I think those are those sort of shaped what I like in short stories now and what some of my favorite short stories are. I like the really creepy, disturbing, unsettling short stories. There's one in Rand Walker's collection, Portable Black Magic, about the paint color Haint Blue and about spirits using that paint color to enter and exit the house. And it is incredible and disturbing, and I love it so much. And then in his new collection of stories, I think it was Keep It 100, he has a 100-word story that is what happens next in the lottery.
Oh, wow.
And it is, like, because we just see the character being stoned to death, but what happens after that? What do they do with her body, and what does her family do? And he addresses that in 100 words, and it is, again, just as disturbing and incredible as the Shirley Jackson story.
One of the interesting things that I start thinking about is that maybe the power of flash fiction and short stories in general is just that you've got the story, the world, but then you've got all this white space surrounding it where you're not developing everything. Like there's a lot unsaid that maybe it's speaking of collaboration earlier, maybe there's a lot more collaboration with the reader creating what's happening outside in that white space.
Can I ask everyone a question?
Do
you find yourselves being drawn to a different, to your point, Robert, I think when I'm reading when I'm reading a novel, I'm really interested in the way like setting is described. And when I'm reading short fiction, I think what I'm interested in is how people behave. And I'm just curious if you all could think about it. Like, do you read differently, or are you drawn to things differently when you read short fiction versus novels?
Yeah, I think for me, short fiction has to make decisions about where it's going to focus. So, so I think I probably do read differently, just because the writer has to write differently, because they have to, like in a book length story, you can develop everything, whereas in a shorter fiction, you really have to make conscious choices. Like, I'm going to focus on this and this, but like everything else, just going to have to ignore.
Right. That's true.
And I think for me, when it comes to shorter fiction, thinking more from like the writing aspect of it, I find it so much easier to play with point of view than with longer work. So when it comes to my longer fiction, I tend to write third person limited. But when it comes to Flash, especially, I find this like very unique, unusual voice that comes out of me that tends to be more like playful and comedic. And I tend to write a lot of second person, which I think can work very well in a very like contained, short. And I'm like a fan of really dark fiction. I don't normally love comedy, but I think that when it is so small, it can really open up a lot of avenues.
Yeah.
You can look at a subject in a funnier way than you might if, you have to spend so much time with the reader getting them to like the characters. And at least for me, as a character-driven reader, it's more quote-unquote acceptable for me to not like a character in a short piece than it is in a long piece, because I don't want to spend that much time with
Not
them.
liking someone.
Yep.
Right, yeah. That makes
A book
sense.
immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, I think we're thinking of the same book.
Yes, and I have an additional one. There are two.
Speaking
I
of
guess,
white space out there for people to fill in.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fun. I want to keep talking to you all about short stories, but I think we need to move on to our guest interviews. So stay tuned for more.
Now we're going to discuss Flash nonfiction with Gina Bareka. Gina Bareka is the author or editor of more than 20 books, including Fast, Funny Women, a collection of 75 Flash nonfiction essays. She was deemed a feminist humor maven by Ms. Magazine and has appeared on CNN, PBS, the BBC, 2020, 48 Hours, The Today Show, NPR, and Oprah as an expert on women, humor, and cultural politics. Learn more about Gina at www.ginabareka.com. Welcome to the Writer's Digest Presents, Gina.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you here. And for this episode, we're talking about Flash fiction, but I thought it would be really exciting and interesting to talk about Flash nonfiction, a topic that you wrote about for us on the writersdigest.com site earlier this year.
It was the perfect place for what I had to say about Flash nonfiction, and it was the great timing, because I did a book last year and another one is coming out in March, and then if all goes well and the waters don't rise, another one will come out in 2023. we have hopes for the future, from Woodhull Press. And the book that I was writing about, particularly for the Writer's Digest piece, which I was so delighted. I've actually heard from a lot of writers who found that piece somehow in classes that used it, writers who were using it when they were teaching their middle school classes. And other people who were in the profession. So it got a lot of reach, and that made me very happy. But when I just this last year was putting together Fast, Funny Women, and it's 75 essays by women on topics that range from hideous, horrible emotional trauma that they turned into humor, and really stupid, funny slapstick moments that you could have turned into trauma, but actually just made themselves funny right from the beginning. And that's what sort of flash fiction and nonfiction do. They're very small pieces of real estate. When I teach writing at the University of Connecticut, I've been a professor there since 1987, when people were actually writing on pieces of paper. And I still encourage my students to write on pieces of paper for their first drafts. I really do think that writing on pieces of paper, whether it's on the back of a CVS receipt, since you could now write all of War and Peace on the back of a CVS receipt. You don't need like a little fancy notebook. You can write anywhere. That's the nice thing about writing. And the idea of writing very short pieces, 750 words or less, is what I used as the defining point for the essays for the books, is that you have to see it like a tiny studio apartment. I'm a New Yorker, which anybody who's even listened to as much as I've said can tell, even though I've been in Connecticut since 1987. I still sound like I'm from Ocean Avenue in Brooklyn, which is where I'm from. And so real estate, you had a 500 square foot studio apartment on the Lower East Side, like I did when I was in graduate school. You learn how to use your real estate very carefully. You had loft beds, and the kitchen was the writing room, which is where you entertained, and your friend sat in the bathtub, and you slept in the sink, and you made use of whatever you had, but you have to do it in a small space. And any kind of flash writing form is basically making the kind of use of real estate in terms of form that you had to do in a small apartment. It was not the place for a Rococo decoration and an exploration of how someone was going to remain solitary in a place. No. It's like, get to the point. We're going to have dinner. Everybody sits down. You get one plate on your lap, and that's how you're going to use it. And that's what you do when you're writing. It's like you have to get to the point. It is not a place for a lot of description. It's not a place for backstories to sort of enliven the elements. It is not a place for plot, unless the plot is the moment that you're discussing at that time. As I said in the Writer's Digest piece, that, all of good fiction and nonfiction holds a mirror up to life, but in flash fiction and nonfiction, you hold a compact mirror up to life. Mm-hmm. You are just looking, it's a miniature version, which doesn't mean, it's like a film short. It doesn't mean that you can't explore the world through that very small frame, but it has to be put into perspective and proportion so that you use that particular frame correctly, or not even correctly, but to the best use of that space. And again, you could take the best passages from long pieces. You could go back to Dostoevsky, and you could remember that one little moment when everything came together. And if you cut out those 750 words, you might make that work. And then it could still go into a longer book. So there are lots of pieces in Fast, Funny Women. I was delighted that the pieces I commissioned from writers who were surprisingly delighted to supply them. So Jane Smiley, who happened to win the Pulitzer Prize, put in, I said, Jane, I know her from Facebook and from her work, but I've never met her. And I said, would you write something? She was like, yeah, absolutely. Mimi Pond, who was a New York Times bestselling graphic novelist, did the cover for Fast, Funny Women and wrote a beautiful piece about fabric. So we've got this short text about textiles, and about growing up and her grandmother looking at the description of wedding dresses, and how the bride was wearing French lace over a kind of raw silk that came through. But it's Mimi's world through that particular fabric description. So it's getting that focus. And what the great thing about an exercise, the 750 word exercise, is that it forces you to pay attention to the details. And writers, too often, we get lost in the clatter and din and noise of everything we want to put in. And 750 words forces us to take it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that way of describing it, because, there's a lot of nonfiction, and I do this where, I love to, dive deep and go into it, but with flash nonfiction, it's more, you get to that moment. I guess one thing I'm interested in, you mentioned the Fast Funny Women, is, was there a variety of styles among those 75 essays? I know the topics were a little bit different, but even the style that people wrote.
Yes, there were many different styles. Writers were able to use whatever sort of genre to present themselves. Marge Piercy created a piece for us. I mean, Marge Piercy has been a hero of mine since high school, and her essay is sort of almost in the form of a prose poem, and it's about sort of what to do during a natural disaster. It's sort of what they were doing during a snowstorm and a blackout. But especially since the book came out during the pandemic, that to treat this with light, during the blackout, with the lightness that humor forces you to bring to the page, I think was a sort of tonic for everybody. So Dawn Lundy Martin, who is an amazing poet, who is one of the people who is head of, or she now is a chair at the University of Pittsburgh in Africana American Studies. She had been a student when I was first teaching at the University of Connecticut. So to have watched Dawn become one of the great poets of our age, and to herself have a named chair at a major university was amazing. And so when I asked Dawn to contribute, it was it was great that she said yes right away. And her piece, actually, is one of the few pieces that had been published elsewhere, was first published in McSweeney's, and is hilarious. And Dawn is known as this very serious poet, and the piece that she wrote is one of the funniest ones that's in there. And then and there again, all of them, because it's fast, funny women, but that doesn't mean that some of the pieces in the book won't break your heart, because as we know, humor deals with the best of humor, deals with what's taboo, with what's unspoken. And as I say in the introduction to the book, because humor and gender is sort of what I've worked with for the last 30 years. That's how I started writing, and what I've sort of stayed with. That humor is about really redemption. Humor allows you to redeem moments that are otherwise lost to frustration, to misery, to tragedy, to longing, to loneliness. And but humor allows you to get your deposit back on those moments. Because if you ask anybody, when I do writers' workshops, and one of the short exercises, I'll ask people to go around and say, they have to write it down, but it's 2 sentences. It's what is the story that you dine out on? What's the story that you tell? And if it isn't the worst thing that ever happened to you, what is? And most of the people will say that the story they dine out on has something to do with the worst thing that ever happened to them. Because the stories that we tell are ways to mitigate, to transform, as I said, to redeem the terrible things. Because once we tell a story, we make it ours. It's not something that happened to us. It's our story. We're the maker of it. We create it. We recreate it. It's recreation. And, that's how humor comes in. It allows us that recreation. And it is it was great to see these different, again, the stories come in. One, a woman who's a professor at Dartmouth, Carolyn Levitt, writes an essay that's sort of taking a 17th century writer that she'd been working on for her scholarship and sort of making almost a Harlequin silhouette romance piece out of it. It's the one that stretches nonfiction most, but since it comes out of her scholarship, it sort of breaks the frame a little bit, but it's wonderful. And that, I mean, and it was, so there are stand-up comics in it. There are, again, writers that we've grown up knowing. Judge Judy Scheinlin is in the book because she was my next door neighbor in Brooklyn. Judy's dad was my dentist, and so I have no shame. And Judy is, one of those people who, if you write her, she answers within 5 minutes. Which actually, so did most of the writers who have been were most well known in the book. Faye Weldon, who wrote A Life and Loves of a She-Devil, who wrote the pilot for Upstairs, Downstairs, which some of us who are old enough to remember that was the first BBC masterpiece theater that ever appeared on American television. Faye wrote the pilot, created the characters for that show that so transformed television. And they write back immediately, and they say yes. And emerging writers have a much harder time. I have a lot of, the book is full of emerging writers. There are people who are in their 70s who've never been published before. They've been writing their whole lives. And there are people who are 20 who this is their first time, but it's not the last time we're going to hear from them. I hope it's not the last time we're going to hear from the 70-year-olds either. But the emerging writers have a much harder time saying yes because they're nervous about hitting send, because hitting send seems so much the moment of the irrevocable. And you have to, one of the pieces of advice I give to every writer and to people like I'm standing next to on the checkout line, you don't have to be a writer, but it's like you have to take those moments of the irrevocable seriously. You have to hit send. The worst thing that'll happen is that somebody will say, this isn't right for us, or go back and edit. Yeah. That's it. I mean, they're not going to come with pitchforks and torches to your door. I mean, really, they're really not. I'll write you a note promising you that. They'll come for other reasons, depending what you do, but they're not going to come because you didn't get your piece right. Most places, if you have an idea, you have your own voice, and you have something to say, really do want to hear from you. You just have to figure out how to get those three things together and then hit send. Once you learn how to hit send, life gets so much easier.
No doubt. I totally agree with that.
Good.
And endorse that fully. I know that you mentioned that you have 2 more flash nonfiction books coming out. Are those going to be humor as well, or are they anthologies? Are they different?
That's a great question. The next one that's coming out that's finished is called Fast, Fierce Women. And because a lot of the essays I realized from the sort of first round, there were a couple of the same authors, but most of the authors are different. Again, I'm sort of casting a net so that some of the authors that I know, and they're sort of anchor authors, Maureen Corrigan, who is the book reviewer for NPR. You'll hear her on Terry Gross. She's a wonderful writer herself, did a great book on Gatsby, a sort of cultural icon. She's brilliant, she's funny. And she wrote, she also, I grew up in Brooklyn, she grew up in Queens. And we came out of families where like the last thing they thought we were going to be are people who dealt with books, and sort of being an out-of-borough girl and sort of growing up into this world and what that meant, like, and having like faces that you didn't like and not looking like you were supposed to. So it's funny, but again, it sort of cuts your throat while she does it. And there's one by Amy Hartel Sherman, who's a hilarious writer, as a blogger, and she writes about when she was a flight attendant on an airline I won't mention, but it's in the book, but how some guy kept screaming that he wanted to get off the plane because it was delayed, and he was doing that, getting increasingly drunk for 4 hours. And this was 20 years ago. This is before people could record such things. And that she went and told the pilots with whom she was friends, and they actually sent like one of those staircases to the plane. And she said, leave. we're making you leave. And he was like, well, you can't make me leave. She said, no, you were asking for 4 hours to leave. You're going to leave now. And the applause and the delight of the rest of the pastor. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, but it's about her saying to this guy, it's finally like, mister, you want to leave? You're going. And it's sort of the triumph of somebody's backbone, their passion. Phyllis Levin, who's an amazing poet, is in it. And she writes about the rituals she used as a child to sort of organize her life out of emotional chaos. Carolyn Levitt, who's a best-selling author, writes, she begins the book, she's writing about again, being turned down at a writing gig because she could tell that the editor really was there to sort of snub her and wasn't going to hire her in the first place. It's a great story about the writing life. So, and the book after that I'm soliciting essays for now, I'll close out this spring, actually is called Fast Fallen Women, because I decided that, the fall of man, it's always pretty generic. Right, it's the fall of man. You got your Miltons, you got your Bibles, but fallen women are all individual, and there are lots of ways to fall. And there's Margaret Atwood talking about it's only when you're pushed off the cliff that you learn whether you're going to fall or whether you're going to fly. And I'll take any advice from Margaret Atwood. And so people are talking about fallen in very different ways, not only the fallen women, like in some kind of Victorian sexual way, but being pushed off the pedestal. And I talk about the fact that, I grew up falling down, falling in love and falling apart, but that you decide how you're going to rise. And then other people are talking about, the fallen, like troops are fallen, but what about the girls who didn't fall themselves but were pushed? What about the girls who were taken by the troops and locked up? And so there are serious issues. Again, humor, if it helps to tell the story, is great. Humor, if it's there for its own sake, as Dorothy Parker said, is just wisecracks. So it's up to the writer to make those 750 words, that space in that one bedroom or studio apartment, every single bit of space has to count.
Yeah, and I like that all three of them are different that way, because it helps show the diversity that is available to writers if they want to go down the path of flash nonfiction. And I think people should check out all three anthologies. One of them's out right now. One's going to be out soon, and then the other one will be out next year.
Right, and again, I'm looking for fallen women. So if anybody's up there falling, they could get in touch.
Would they do that through your website?
Yes, they can, and my, through ginabareka.com, as you mentioned, and my email is up there. And again, I'm active on Facebook. If they come onto my public Facebook page, I often write about writing, put up prompts. I put up the articles that I write for Psychology Today. I'm up to about 7.5 million views on that, and a lot of those pieces are about writing. And I love to write about writing because it's what I do, and it's pretty down home advice, and it's also my everyday dealing with what this is like. And it's about not quitting your day job, and it's about figuring out how to get to the hitting send, and about how to find your audience and find your voice.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Gina. This has been great to talk about flash nonfiction. And anyone who wants to learn more, we've already mentioned a few times, go to ginabareka.com.
Thank you, Robert.
Hello and welcome everybody to part 2 of our MFA workshop conversation. I am editor Michael Woodson here with managing editor Moriah Richards. If you missed part 1 of our conversation, go back to our January episode. And here we are going to hopefully be answering any and all of your questions that remain.
I don't know about how you felt at the end of your bachelor's degree, but I was done.
Okay, I was so burnt out by the end of my getting my bachelor's, mostly because I was also working, and I was feeling really, I'm curious. I really want to talk about workshop, because part of that was I loved to write, and I liked learning how to give constructive feedback, which I think is a big part of workshop when done well. But I was just like drained emotionally from sitting down and hearing people not give me really helpful advice and just say mean things about what I'd written. And there was one time in particular, and this was a year where it was just a bad writing year for me. I didn't have a lot of good ideas. I learned a lot in how to write poorly, to be honest, but I wrote a story that I was actually quite proud of, and it got just like, it was just did not go well. My workshop did not go well. And one of the students who was very, I don't know, just honest, I guess he would say he was, said something just really mean. And my professor like stopped the workshop and said, "We are not cruel in this classroom." And he was helpful, but it also made me feel too seen. I was like, okay, yeah. Okay. So that was mean. That's not me just reading into it.
Right.
Because sometimes workshop is amazing, and I think it is dependent on the structure and also the professor leading it. I'm just curious about your experience with an MFA in workshop.
Yeah, and this is something that if you're considering an MFA program, I think it's really important to ask questions during the application process about workshop structure.
Okay.
Because so the traditional workshop structure in an MFA program, and this is going back to like the 70s, right? It is that before the class, you will submit like before you come together, you will submit your writing. So it's usually about a week that people will have your piece. Many programs will also limit the amount of pages that you can submit at any time. So you can still write a novel and workshop your novel, or a stage play, or, but it's a certain number of pages that you can have at any one time. And that's just to prevent, everyone submitting 80 pages. Right. Because it's usually 2 or 3 people are going on the same day. So you'll have about a week with the work. People will generally, and this is the kind of weird academic part of it, because the professors have to ensure that you are participating. So they will generally request that you print off 2 copies of the story, one to hand back to the author with your notes on it, and one to hand into the professor. So you don't get graded on what you're saying, just so that they can check in and make sure that you are being an active participant in the workshop. So then it's workshop day, right? So you come and you're going to get workshopped, and you sit down, and everyone else will discuss your piece in front of you, and you are generally not allowed to speak. You're not, it's exactly. You're not, like, it's a rule. Like, you're not allowed to speak until it's over. So our program gave us, and so I had 3 different professors in workshop. I had 4 workshop classes, but one professor I took twice. But they each had this rule that at the end of when the conversation came to a close, you were, as the author, you were allowed to speak for 5 minutes. And my problem with this structure is that, number one, it is very difficult for a lot of people, myself included, to sit there and feel like everyone is tearing you apart. It's almost like people are talking about you in another room and they don't realize that you're hearing them. Ouch. Yes. That is how it felt to me. And part of that, I think, was my age. I was a very green writer. A lot of these people had been honing their craft for much longer than I. And to me, it felt like there was a huge gap in the quality of our work. So I was only a lot of times hearing the negative. Sure, of course. And the positive things were getting buried because, when they're sitting there and they're like, well, I didn't understand this. I don't get this. Why does it have to be this way? Right. And then one person is like, this was actually really great. I love the character. I love the dialogue. You don't hear what they liked. You hear about how much it sucked, right? Well, and tell me if this was true for you too. Like, for me, it was structured like you start with what's working and then you finish with what isn't working. And so, like, the last thing I was left with always was
a list of things that made it a bad story.
So that is not how my workshops were structured. It was just an open conversation. I even had one professor who never spoke.
Oh.
So he was present to make sure that things didn't get like totally out of hand, but it was just a conversation about like whatever people wanted to talk about.
Okay.
And to me, that was the hardest one because, you know, I think it's the natural way that we converse as, I want to say American society, right? Like if you have 3 people in a group of 5 who are all bashing something, your natural instinct is not to be like, well, actually, it's to kind of go with the flow, right? Especially if you have 3 powerful, dominating voices. So, you know, if you're writing on your paper 10 things that you liked and 2 things you didn't like, in the conversation, because it is tending in a negative direction, you might just say the 2 things you didn't like.
Right.
But if that's all you're hearing when you're sitting in workshop, it can be very discouraging.
Yes, of course.
So it all depends on your personality, your experience, and like even just the, like another thing I experienced in workshop is that some of my classmates had a hard time hearing the criticism.
Sure, of course.
So they would spend their whole 5 minutes kind of being defensive about the work. And I think that's a natural tendency, right? When you feel like you're being attacked, you want to stand up for yourself. Yeah. But in doing that, they lose all the good things that we like. You know what I mean?
Of course.
So nowadays, workshops across the United States are changing up their workshop form. Now, I experienced this not in an actual workshop, but in one of my craft courses. One of our professors was like, hey, I'm going to try a structure of workshop, which is called the asking. Oh. So it was structured at the beginning the same way, right? You receive somebody's work, you have a week to read it, you come to class with your notes prepared. But the only person who is allowed to speak and direct the conversation is the author.
Oh, wow.
So generally you would come with a list of questions. What did you think about the characters? What did you think about the setting? What did you think about the ending? And you are only allowed to speak to those questions.
That makes sense to me because when I think about the times where I felt, I don't want to say critique was wasted, but things that like ultimately were not what I was hoping to work on, or like things that like I just didn't agree with. Like there are some things where I would get feedback of like, wow, that person was right. I really want to work on that. Whereas other times I'm like, you know what, actually I stand by what I chose to do and I'm not gonna mess with that. And I'm always interested and willing to hear how any of my writing can be better. I mean, we're editors. Like we're constantly getting notes on each other's work.
Right.
And I love that because it's constructive and it's helpful. But if I could lead the conversation and be like, I don't love this aspect of the story, or at least in my head, I can know like I'm going to ask a question about this because I think it needs some work and I don't know how to work on it yet.
And I think for me, the most powerful part of the asking workshop structure was that a lot of times in a workshop, I will have been thinking about something like, oh, you know, I really don't think that this character's motivation is very clear. But those were not things that were discussed during workshop.
Right.
And then if I ask those in my last 5 minutes, people who hadn't had a chance, like if you don't have a chance to think about it, how can you respond?
Right. Absolutely.
So with the asking, since I had a full 20 minutes or whatever it was to lead the conversation, I would be able to say, were the characters' motivations clear? Do you feel like you understood where they were coming from? Give people a little bit to sit there to review the work, to think about it, and then come up with a response that was helpful to me.
Oh, I love that.
So when you're looking into MFA programs, you know, you're allowed to ask questions of the directors. You can, usually their emails are right on the program page. You can reach out. Hey, how do you guys structure your workshops? Are you doing any new or experimental structures? You know, having the power to ask those questions is not something that I realized that I had when I was
Yeah.
applying.
Yeah.
So it's important to know the different structures out there, because I think for me personally, the traditional structure is not helpful. I think with my anxiety problems, I just focus on, oh, everybody thinks I'm
Sure.
terrible.
Yes.
I must be terrible. And I don't hear the things that will allow me to improve the things that need improved.
Totally.
And highlight the things that I'm actually doing very well.
And that's a better, and we should keep going, but that's a much better critique to me, because like, even just now I'm in a writer's group casually, and throughout NaNoWriMo, I had said something, I had expressed a concern about something in my writing to my friends. And I said, you know, I don't think I'm very good at this. And then they were like, okay, tell me what you think you're good at then.
Right.
And I was like, well, I think I'm pretty good at setting, and I think I'm really pretty good at atmosphere and mood and blah, blah, blah. And they were like, if you just lean into those things, this other thing that you're concerned about will probably solve itself. And they were just really helpful in helping me notice what I actually think I'm okay at. And it ultimately just made my writing better.
Yeah, and I think that is something that an MFA is a pressure cooker.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I will say that. So the writer that I was when I left my undergraduate degree, like if you put my work side by side from my thesis to, you know, I guess it was just 2 years prior, because I went to a 2-year program, you would not have thought that was the same person.
I mean, honestly, though, like
completely different.
That's kind of the goal, though, right? Like, just like
Yes.
to continue to get better at the thing you are probably already good at.
And that was the thing. Like I wasn't able to see that until years after my program, when I was like, man, you know, going through this box of material from my undergrad, like the themes are still there. You know, I've always been particularly strong with my dialogue, but the rest of it has gotten like worlds better. And I do credit that to being able to take more craft courses.
Nice.
That is something that, you know, we do focus a lot on the workshop. I think that is a strength for getting your MFA, is having dedicated time to have your material reviewed, but just being able to study things that you might not have
Absolutely.
even known that you had an interest in.
Right.
Like flash fiction, I never really thought about it until my program, and now here I am at Writer's Digest leading the Flash Fiction February Challenge. Like, it allows you to explore completely different avenues. And something that I don't know if you are aware of is that depending on what kind of program you are in, sometimes they'll even let you study across genres.
Oh.
Yes. So if you are going and you are studying, say, fiction, for some programs, you will be able to take craft poetry classes or craft nonfiction classes. But not every program allows you to do that. So I wrote a lot of cross-genre material before I got my MFA. My program did not allow you to study cross genres. I was only allowed to take craft classes from the fiction track.
Okay.
Which I didn't know before I applied there.
Right.
And so I write a lot less of creative nonfiction and poetry than I did before I went into my program, because I feel like, you know, I jumped 10 levels writing fiction, and I kind of grew maybe 3 levels doing the poetry and creative nonfiction on my own.
Totally.
So it is something to definitely keep in mind.
Yeah.
If you're looking at, because they don't always advertise that on their websites, right?
Yeah.
They say, we have these 3 different programs, but they don't say
anything else.
Right.
Right. It's interesting to hear you say that you were on the younger side of people in their MFA program, because mainly a lot of my friends did immediately go into an MFA, and they also were like wishing they had taken just maybe a year between, just to like take a rest before jumping back in. And that made me curious about, like, I could not have afforded to go to an MFA right away. I just knew I needed to get a job, and it was stressing me out to like need a job. I've kind of like ruminated on the idea of getting my MFA program as an adult now working. And I'm curious, like, what does that look like for people who are working full time? Is it something that you feel is worthwhile, or well, is it something that you feel is doable?
It is definitely doable. I do want to say, knowing myself, if I hadn't gotten my MFA, I'm a now or never kind of academic person, right? Mm-hmm. I did my bachelor's right out of high school. I did my MFA right out of my bachelor's. And mm-hmm. there was something in the back of my mind that said, if you don't do it now, you're never going to do it.
Yeah.
And that is definitely true for me.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are that kind of person and you're considering your program, like, don't let it become something in your rearview mirror.
Sure.
If it's something you really, really know that you want to do, right? For a lot of people, both my parents got their master's degrees when I was in college.
Okay.
It's something that they never even really thought about wanting until they didn't have to worry about me anymore.
Yeah,
and they're like, hey, with all this time to ourselves, like, we would love to further our education.
Go back to school, yeah.
And the MFA is a really great program for that, style of the program. So there are several different forms, I guess you can say.
Okay.
There's the full residency, which is what I did. Mm-hmm. That is the traditional college experience, right? All of your classes are in person. I do want to do a little caveat here because of COVID. A lot of classes are doing either totally virtual or partial virtual. Yeah. So I do want to say, like, full residencies have had to adapt a little bit. Mm-hmm. Some programs are back full in person, but if that is something that is a concern to you, mm-hmm. Those are definitely questions to ask because, just because in 2022 they're going to be doing virtual classes doesn't mean they're going to continue that into 2023. But traditionally, most full residency programs will have an option for you to be full-time or part-time. So I was a full-time student. Mm-hmm. I want to be here for every class. I want to have all of my classes right in a row, and I want to graduate in 2 years. In my program, the people who were part-time took 1 or 2 less classes a semester, and they graduated a semester or 2 later. So they were still a full residency, right? They were there in Philadelphia. They were coming to class, but they were also more flexible in their schedule.
Right.
So on the other end of the spectrum, you have a low residency. So this kind of program does not require you to be in a classroom, except for sometimes it's anywhere between 7 to 10 days a year. They will bring all of their students to the campus for a week-long workshop experience. And that's really just a way to help you to get to know the people that you're studying with, get to know your professors. And it's more like a conference from what I understand. But generally, it's more like a virtual program. Okay. You have your lessons online. You are generally working a full-time job and doing your classwork in your off hours. Okay. It's a lot more of a flexible college experience. And when it came to, I asked myself, can you do a low residency program part-time? And I'll be honest with you, I have no idea.
Okay, great. Yeah.
That is something that I think that I looked on many websites, for these campuses and these programs, and I couldn't find a strict answer. That's just something that if you're interested in, you would have to ask each individual program. Okay. Because I know full residency, most programs do offer a part-time.
Dual. Okay.
But then there is also the dual degree program. Most of these programs are full residency programs. Yeah. But the way that they work is that they allow you to get 2 degrees from the university simultaneously.
Oh, wow.
So a program that I actually was accepted to and I really considered going to would have allowed me to get my MFA in fiction alongside my master's in editing.
Oh, wow.
So it was the same amount of years, but it was just more classes. I ended up not going there partially because I didn't know if editing was where I was gonna go, and partially because it was a smaller, newer program, and I was attracted to like the more recognizable name.
Sure.
And for anyone who, like, it's not a secret, it's on my LinkedIn, like, I went to Temple University.
Oh, yeah.
Which is known for its MFA programs.
Right.
So I was like, that's the, I don't need any more questions. That's the one, which might have been a mistake in the long run because I didn't ask any questions.
Sure.
But the cool thing about dual degrees is it's not just things in the publishing and editing field, like the program that I was considering. You could also get your MBA. Any kind of master's program that the school allows you to partner with your MFA, you can study those together.
Okay.
And if you're anything like me, you might be thinking like, that sounds like hell. Why would you take so many classes at the same time? It just seems very overwhelming to me.
Yeah.
But if you do these dual degree programs, if you know for a fact, I'm going to get my MFA and I'm definitely going to get my MBA, packaging them together this way saves you a lot of money.
Okay.
And a lot of time.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to do a 2-year program and then another 2-year program.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So it all depends on what your specific goals are. And that's, I didn't know. I didn't know what my goals were. I didn't know to ask these questions.
Well, of course. Don't you ever think like the older I get, the more I realize how young I was when I was asked to make like huge decisions that I probably wasn't ready to make yet, which is probably why I'm ruminating on it now. Because I'm like, well, maybe I'm ready to make it.
Well, and it's also for the time that I was at in my life, I was engaged and I was not willing to move states and states away from my partner. Right. So he was getting his degree in Pittsburgh. And so I only applied to schools within a reasonable megabus distance.
Yeah, of course.
To Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And so when I was getting all of these rejections from my programs, I was like, okay, well, if I don't get in anywhere, I'll just go live in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I did get into a few places, but it's one of those things, if you cast a wider net, then you'll have more options. But at this stage in my life, I'm not willing to move.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to quit my job.
Right.
Because I love my job. I love it here. So something like a low residency program would be perfect for me.
Yeah. Oh, perfect.
But at the time I was like, I'm going to get it done. I'm going to do it so that I can travel on, I was even like, this just tells you the kind of human being I am, right? So I stacked my classes so that for every single semester I was there, I only had classes Monday through Thursday, so that or usually it was Tuesday through Thursday. I would shuffle them, right? Yeah. So then I could get on the megabus Friday morning, be in Pittsburgh, and not have to come back until Monday.
Yeah. Of course.
Like I did make it work, and at the time I was working freelance, so I was working remotely. I could work from anywhere.
Yeah.
But I was like, I can do this program in a way that I can make my life fit into it. But I was willing to uproot my life and do certain things to get the program where you don't have to do it that way.
Sure, of course.
You can make the program fit your life and not the other way around.
This has been so helpful and interesting. And I have to imagine listeners who are going through the same experience of deciding whether or not they want to do this, I hope this has been helpful. But if there's a listener out there who hasn't even started questioning it, like, how do you know, how does someone ask or know, like, if an MFA program is right for them?
So my short answer is that no one but you can know. My little bit longer answer is why do you want to go? For me, it was because I wanted to become a better writer. and I wanted to extend my time to have to make decisions about my career.
Yeah.
And I met those goals. You know, by the time I left my program, I knew I wanted to be an editor. And I was able to do a lot of writing in those 2 years. But if you're going because you think that it's going to land you a job. So say you want to be a teacher, even if you get your MFA, it is not a guarantee that you will be hired to be a professor. You know, it's tough out there in the job market. Even if you get your MFA, there is no guarantee that you will get published. It's not that kind of stepping stone, which I think sometimes it is sold as like, all your dreams will come true once you have this diploma, and it's not true. So if you're going because you're going for yourself and your craft, I would say definitely explore what options are out there. If you're going because you think that it's gonna get you someplace different from where you're at, I would highly recommend doing more research and spending more time with it, because it's expensive to go to a program, but it's also extremely expensive to apply to programs. So just knowing what's best for you financially, emotionally, in your writing career, getting all of those ducks in a row, you'll have your answer at the end of that, whether or not now is the time for you to go and if you should go.
Well, thank you so much, Mariah. This was so helpful and fun.
Thank you, Michael. It's been great.
I am here with Ran Walker to talk about his flash fiction and microfiction. Ran is the author of 24 books. He is the winner of the Indie Author Project's 2019 Indie Author of the Year Award, the 2019 Black Caucus of the ALA Fiction Book eBook Award, the 2018 Virginia Author Project Award for Adult Fiction, and the 2021 Blind Corner Afrofuturism Microfiction Award. He teaches creative writing at Hampton University and Writer's Digest University and lives with his wife and daughter in Virginia. Visit his website, ranwalker.com, for more info. Ran, welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm so glad you can join us.
Well, thank you for having me, Amy.
So this episode is all about flash fiction, and I think you take it to the extreme by focusing a lot on 100-word stories, which and correct me if I'm wrong, I think are called drabbles, and 50-word stories, which are called dribbles.
That's correct.
I wondered, how did you get into flash fiction, and what appeals to you so much about writing such short stories?
Well, when I first started writing, I started with novels because that's what everybody told me I should be doing. And I wrote several of them, but I just kept feeling like I was saying a lot more than I really wanted to say. So I started shrinking, and I went from novels to novellas. Wrote a couple of those and felt I was still being a little bit too verbose with what I was trying to express. And then I went to short stories and felt the same, and eventually got to flash fiction, but I didn't really find my sweet spot until I hit the 50 to 100 word area. And I kind of came across that by accident. I was studying a poetic form called the Kwansaba, which is a 49-word poem. It's 7 lines, 7 words per line, and no word of more than 7 letters. And I was writing those and feeling like something could be done with that in a narrative way. And, you know, add one more word on there, you have a dribble. And that's literally how it happened. I started with the poems and then tried to make the poems more like the stories that I wanted to write.
That's really interesting, because that's actually your collection of Kwansabas was actually the first of your writing that I read. So that was my introduction to you, the very specific form of the 7 lines and 7 words and 7 letters. And as I was reading it, I was thinking how much, I don't want to say dedication, but intention must be behind each of those words in order to make a coherent thought, but also fulfill those very specific guidelines. And I think that's, I was actually wondering if, because you started in that way, working on those kwansabas and adding the one word to make it closer to a dribble or make it an actual dribble. Do you see the connection between poetry and short story in terms of the word choice for your short stories, like in being that intentional with them?
Definitely. When I first started writing dribbles, I quickly realized that it's very different writing a story versus writing a poem. But, there's that gray area too. There is the prose poem, and then there is a narrative prose poem. Mm-hmm. So there are things that could look almost identical, and you just have to blow on it and it becomes one thing or the other. But when you're writing something that's short, every single word counts. And I have to ask myself, do I really want to say it this way? Or maybe I can get back one of those words by using a contraction. Mm-hmm. So I'm constantly shaping it and trying to find the best words to fit that specific word count.
Right.
Sometimes I get it right, and other times I might miss it a little bit. But it's always, like you said, intentional and trying to find those words.
I feel like that sort of intentionality would also, add more to your vocabulary. I feel like I would spend a lot of time in a thesaurus trying to make sure that I chose the exact right word to create the most meaning that a reader could infer for that particular story or poem.
It's funny you said that, because I use that as an exercise a lot of times with some of my stories. I'll look for the strangest word that I've come across that week and see if I can build a story around it. And actually a couple of them in Keep It 100 where the words might seem really strange. It's because I came across them and felt that they could actually, a story could be made around the words. And the collection I'm working on right now, I actually pit two definitions against each other because they're so close. Like one is about the fear of failure. The other one is about rooting for one's failure.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So I use, how they give the examples of the words being used in the sentence. I put the definitions and then the examples using the same characters. And through the examples, you actually get a full story.
Okay. I can't wait to read that. So your newest novel, A Burst of Gray, I will hold it up here, is actually 100 stories told in 100 words each. And I think the premise of this story is so creative. I was instantly hooked in that only people who find their true soulmate can ultimately see in color. How did you come up with that idea?
Actually, I was online and I was just looking at prompts, things to write about. And I saw a prompt that kind of boiled down to that very thing.
Really?
And I was like, well, what would that look like, though? Like, the idea was maybe expressed in 7 or 8 words. And I was like, this is a writing prompt. What can I do with this prompt? And then I started thinking about the cultures that would evolve out of this. And I thought about a character who would depend on this science in a way that most people wouldn't. So that was the original idea. And when I tried to write it, didn't work. I wrote it longhand and a moleskin and everything. Did not work. I abandoned the idea. Then I came back later on after I wrote Keep It 100. And I said, what if I wrote this as 100 different stories that all told the same narrative arc? Like a novel with 100 different 100-word stories. And I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. But then I wrote the first 2 or 3 and it just kind of started falling out in clumps. And I was like, I think I can do this thing. And I got to 50 and I was like, oh man, I'm into this. So I've got to find out where it goes. But yeah, that's how it started.
I think that's so interesting that it came from a writing prompt. I think that's fantastic. And I think finding a soulmate is a challenging enough task in life already. And the idea of attaching that to being able to see color really amps up the stakes. Like, and you present this in the book, do you keep searching for your soulmate in the hopes of being able to, not only meet them, but finally see color? Or do you partner with somebody who you love, but I guess isn't your soulmate, and knowing that you might run into them, a soulmate someday, and have to make that choice? So I think that's a lot to cover in 10,000 words. And you managed to do it. Was your first draft much longer than the end 10,000 words? Or have you written short stories enough now that you are able to write shorter naturally?
That's a very good question. Normally, I would overshoot things and then edit back. But with the novel, you can actually kind of plan what should happen in each of the chapters. And I was able to actually just measure it out mentally and then just write into it. So I never had to overwrite. But that probably comes from having written so many 100-word stories. I think up to this point, of the microfiction collections I've put together, there are over 500 different stories that I've written. So I've gotten really comfortable with expressing ideas in short spaces.
Wow, that's a lot of short stories. That's really impressive. What's your experience in reading short stories?
Well, the thing I like about short stories is that you can be really resonant in a short amount of space. When I think of some of the classic, most anthologized short stories like Faulkner's Rose for Emily, The Lottery, Shirley Jackson, Baxter's Procrustes by Charles Chestnut, there's something about the ending that just, where you walk away from the story going, whoa. And it kind of stays with you. And I love that space that you get to feel the echoes of the story after the fact. So I definitely agree with you on that. And I'm definitely a lot more drawn to shorter works. While I like short stories, I'm always impressed to see what people can do with even fewer words. Because I think sometimes we don't really measure our words when we write. As writers, we don't really measure our words. I tell my students, think about each word like it's $1.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to spend $1,000 or would you rather spend 100? And what exactly are you giving me for 100? Can you give me something that has the same value, if not more value, than something that costs 1,000 or 10,000? So I'm always looking for writers who are able to express themselves in that way, and I've found quite a few. When I find them, I go and buy everything they write.
Yeah.
There are a few that like I'm from Mississippi originally, and there is a poet who also is a memoirist. Her name is Beth Ann Finley, and she has a collection called Heating and Cooling. It's a nonfiction collection. And a lot of those pieces were published originally as poems, but they read as straight nonfiction as well. And I just love what she does with space, the economy of words that she uses. And there are a number of people who are really, really strong in the area. Grant Faulkner, another person who's very strong in that area. And when I read those stories, I get so much from them.
So you mentioned a couple of your favorite writers of microfiction. What are some of your favorite outlets to submit to?
Well, Grant Faulkner is one of the co-founders of 100-Word Story, which I believe was one of the first periodicals to really do that. That's always a great place to submit. There is a new journal called The Sense of Fictionist. I love that title too because it says exactly what it is. And I believe that the editor is in her 4th issue. It's a wonderful, wonderful journal. I know that Smoke Loan Quarterly has been known to publish short pieces. There's just a variety of different places that you can go to. Duotrope has a list of them. And what's funny, though, is that there are places, and this is just a small little gripe, but there are places that claim to publish flash fiction that won't even look at microfiction.
Really?
And, it has to be 300 words. It must be 500 words. And I'm like, 500 words, that's 5 stories for me. Unless it's an interlinking story, then I can't really submit to them. So I find that sometimes it's best for me, once I've gotten enough of the individual pieces done, to just handle it myself, because I do have a background in both law and publishing. And I believe the work deserves to be in the universe and in the dialogue for microfiction. So if it's not there and people are hesitant about putting it there, I'll put it there myself.
Yeah, you do. How many books have you self-published at this point?
I believe that it's like 22 of the 24.
Okay.
The others were published by other publishers. But, clearly I love self-publishing. And I've gotten to the point where I feel that, and this is no diss to anybody, but I've been doing this so long, and with my background, I feel like sometimes, and this, like I said, it's not a diss, but when I look at what other people are doing and what I'm doing, I feel that my work is comparable in many respects to what is already on the shelves. And my books are on the shelves in different places as well, so I don't feel like there's anything lost by that.
No, and certainly your the bio that I read of you at the top reflects that, I think, with all of the awards that you've won, deservedly so. I want to go back to what you said about some outlets not being open to microfiction, and thinking about it, I think Writer's Digest might also be one of them. We do the Your Story submission, where we have a photo prompt in each issue, and we ask writers to submit, in most cases, I think one of them is a 600-word or fewer story. But when we get stories that are like 450 words or 500, we always say, oh, they're too short. It's not going to fill the page. And maybe I need to think about that a little bit differently and think about the story itself fills the page, even if the word count does not. Does writing the strange, as you called it in your article for Writer's Digest about this, does that resonate more for you when you write short stories than writing fiction based in reality?
I never really thought about it. When I teach my classes and the stories I assign, I've had students say, are all of the stories weird like this? And it so happens that most of them are. I grew up really enjoying like The Twilight Zone, Amazing Stories, Tales from the Crypt. And I think when you can get those stories done the right way, then there's nothing better than that. So I used to have this saying that out of every 10 episodes of a particular show like that, only 2 of them are going to be good. The other 8 are not going to be as good, but those 2 are going to be so good that you're going to keep coming back for more. And I do find those fun to write. And when I first started writing, honestly, I thought that was what I was going to do. I was going to write horror. I was going to be. Victor LaValle is doing a very good job with that right now. But I was thinking that's what I'm going to do. And now that I see that there are people out there able to do it successfully and that there is an audience for people of color doing that type of thing, I've gotten even more jazzed about it. Like, Jordan Peele's over here. Donald Glover's over here. Victor LaValle is writing. Tanana Reeve Due is writing. Everybody's having this conversation, and we're in these strange places, and I'm loving it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love reading it. They're some of my favorite stories, those sort of strange ones that give you goosebumps. I saw you posted something on Twitter the other day, maybe it was yesterday, about writing a story that scared you. Was that how you put it?
Okay. So can I share the story with you?
I would love that. Because
I haven't shared it with anyone.
Okay.
And it's actually based off of something that's real.
Okay. That makes it even more scary, I think.
Yes, very unsettling. This one's called Black Water. She had nightmares of black water trickling from the hotel faucet, shooting out from the shower head, swirling around the commode, even dripping from her toothbrush. It was always black water. and the water had always come from above, a tank on a higher floor, or perhaps the roof, containing the body of a woman thought to have disappeared. In her dreams, the water would pool at her feet before rising slowly up her calves to her thighs and hips, forming a black liquid curtain around her body. Then it would pull her until she slid down the drain.
Yeah, that's unsettling, but I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so creepy.
It's like one of those things that, I feel a little uncomfortable. I have to detach myself from the words as I'm reading them. But yeah. And there was actually a situation, I'm sure you heard about it. I do a lot of true crime. And that story always just made me feel really, really uncomfortable.
Yeah. But the way you describe it, it's such a visceral thing. Like you can almost feel it, and I don't want to go take a bath or take a shower for a little while because that's what might come out. So you are, for a couple of years now, you have been a judge for the Writer's Digest short story competition. After reading so many submissions, which I think are in the hundreds at this point, maybe thousands, what advice do you have for people who are entering short story competitions?
I would first make sure that I'm following every single instruction for the competition. There's really like a template for writing short stories, and that's available everywhere on the internet. But as far as the writing itself, figure out where the story is supposed to start. Sometimes we start where we see it starting, but that's not really where it should start. Every story has something happening before the action and after the action. What's the most important place to start the story? And most people are not really familiar with their stories enough. They think of them as like it's a TV show or film, and you have to kind of like create this. With a short story, you don't have the luxury of exposition building up to the rising action and so forth. You have to kind of start in medias res, right there in the heart of things. And once you figure out where to start, figure out what that first sentence is going to be. Because like you said, if I'm reading 1,000 stories, you've got to hook me very quickly. Mm-hmm. And one more tip, because I have a whole boatload of tips, but the other thing is make grammar and punctuation your friend or your friends. Mm-hmm. I believe Stephen King refers to it as the toolbox in on writing. Get very familiar with that. And if you're a person who you don't know what a comma splice is, or how to use a semicolon, or that you should indent each paragraph that you write with, that you're not submitting something that's formatted for a book but for national competition, then those are things you can do ahead of time that will better your chances of getting farther in the process.
So
another thing too, and this is something that's really amazing, because I think last year I reviewed 1,000 stories. This year is a little under 1,000. Mm-hmm. And when a good story comes along, it stands out. Mm-hmm. It pops. And I'm sitting there like, oh my goodness. And I really want to email you and say, this story is so good. The best I can do is just push it to the next round. But some people really have an excellent grasp of story. And when I read it in my bones, I feel like this is something that could easily be published somewhere and even anthologized at times.
Wow.
So far, and I'm kind of far into the grading this year of stories, but I found some excellent stories. In fact, I plan on rereading the stories again because some of them are that good.
Wow,
so
that's great.
I'm very excited about it. But those, people who really have a firm grasp also set the bar really high.
Right.
It's like a curve. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is what an A+ looks like. And then everything else kind of falls into its own category. So, but the things I said earlier, those help you to get past a lot of the initial dismissals. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I have one last question for you. I wonder, do you have any new books in the works? I've finished your newest, A Burst of Gray, and now I want something else.
Well, I just finished a collection called A Library of Afro Curiosities, or The Library of Afro Curiosities.
Okay.
It's another collection of 100-word stories. There are 100 of them. Blackwater is one of the stories there.
Perfect.
And they're all over the place. Some of them are extremely meta.
Mm-hmm.
I love playing with the form in different ways. I have one that's just a list of song lyrics. Let me tell you what I mean. So,
Okay.
One of my favorite Beatles songs is Come Together.
Yeah, okay.
And those lyrics are ridiculous. And I was looking at John Lennon's like, yeah, this is just gobbledygook. Yeah, and people are like, we like to make sense of their stuff. Paul is dead, the walrus, this means this, each verse is devoted to a member. And we do all of this hyper analysis, on like Jordan Peele level analysis on these songs. And then the songwriter's like, oh, this is just gobbledygook. And I was like, that's perfect. Maybe I should just include the lyrics of a fictional song that people have debated for years, since everyone seems to get the lyrics wrong anyway, and just see what kind of story falls out of that. So there are a lot of really fun things in that collection, but it's called The Library of Afro Curiosities. And also, I just finished a Christmas book.
Oh, really?
The title came courtesy of Grant Faulkner. It's called
Okay.
A Different Kind of Christmas Story. And it's about an African-American community in Mississippi during 1983.
Okay.
And it's just, the kid wants a Mr. T action figure for Christmas. Mm-hmm. And his sister wants a Cabbage Patch doll. And it's just a bunch of fun stories about the community. There's nothing in there that is dreadful or, the
Okay.
conflict is very light. Mm-hmm. It's a story of Black joy. And I've always wanted to have a Christmas story, and I've written one, and it will be coming out next year.
Thank you so much for chatting with me and joining us on the Writer's Digest Presents podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Same here. Thank you so much, Amy.
For this episode's writing prompt, challenge yourself to write a 50 or 100-word story about a character who cannot or will not leave their home. Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Join us next month when we'll be talking with debut authors about their first publishing experiences. Until then, you can find book recommendations from the WD staff at bookshop.org/shop/writersdigest and visit writersdigest.com for more writing prompts, advice, and inspiration. You can email us at writers.digest@aimmedia.com to share your feedback. We look forward to hearing from you. Bye. But the one other one that I will never be able to forget is an Elizabeth Bowen story called The Cat Jumps. It's about this couple, I think probably in the 1920s, not our current 20s. We can't say that stuff anymore, right? 20s, because we no longer know what we're talking about. In the 1920s, and they buy this house where a murder has taken place. And the first names of the husbands are both Harold. So the husband who killed his wife in the house was called Harold, and the new couple, the husband is called Harold. But the new couple, they decide that they are above the idea, like the idea that a murder happened in that house doesn't bother them in the least. They're too smart to believe that that could affect the way the house feels. So they buy it and they fix it up, get rid of all the blood stains or whatever, invite their friends over, and it gets to them and it gets to their friends during this party.
Our
sorry.
fifth co-host, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep.
Yeah, for
I'm so
those
sorry,
who
it's the
cannot
cat.
see, we have a cat climbing up on Amy right now.
Just a rogue
As
cat.
I'm talking
It's
about-
not Amy's.
Yeah, it's just
As I'm talking about the story, the cat jumps. It's perfect.
Right.
So the all of the friends and the couples, they end up freaking out, and one of the women guests, she goes and locks the doors to all of their bedrooms and traps them with each other, like couples with couples, and they're all, very disturbed about the murder that has taken place in the house, and they don't know who has locked the doors, and it is creepy. It is so creepy, and I love it.
Is that it? You're not going to tell us more?